Because we've got some fantastic speakers that are about to drop some fantastic knowledge and insights from their experiences. I am Z, for those that don't know me, Christopher Zember. Thank you guys so much for being here. Welcome to Capital Factory, welcome to South by Southwest. And we are kicking things off in a big way today. Thank you to our sponsor for this room. I've had the pleasure of working with Advanced Technology International, ATI, for a number of years in organizing these, and they're sponsoring the sessions that are happening in here today. So we've got this one and 3 other sessions today, and then 4 fantastic sessions tomorrow. And I've had the pleasure of organizing and will be emceeing all of those. But if you guys don't know who ATI is, you definitely should. So ATI is responsible for delivering over $3 billion a year in federal funding to startups and other non-traditional companies. So if you haven't heard of ATI and you fall into that category, definitely get to know them. You see some of the stats up here. With that, we will have, at the end of the session, a microphone roaming around for Q&A. Please do make sure you wait for the microphone before you ask your question so that we can get that in the audio and the video recording. And with that, without further ado, I want to hand it over to Josh Mark Hughes and Dr. Radha Plumb for their conversation, looking back and looking forward with DoD's former Chief Data and AI Officer. So please join me in welcoming them to the stage.
Thank you so much, Steve. Everyone can hear me all right? Yeah, great. Awesome. Well, it is fantastic to be back with all of you. It's nice to see some familiar faces and friends in this audience, people that know this defense and AI space probably better than I do, so maybe you should be asking the questions, which we'll get a chance to do in a moment. And of course, it's a big honor to be with Radha, who I haven't seen since we were at the bar last night. So it's great to reconnect with you, but now with a bigger group of friends up here. Let me just set the tone. Obviously, we're recording and we're on the record, but we're going to have a really candid conversation because we're lucky to be here at Austin and South by Southwest. And to set the stage a little bit, sort of zoom out from this, I want to point out, we are right now at a moment where I think the whole country and certainly the tech industry is acknowledging that there is a massive change in the way artificial intelligence is reshaping every sphere of our society, including warfare and national security. And it's been a technology that's been around for decades, but we're seeing a sudden shift. And we've seen these sudden shifts in technology before, and it appears that we are at that moment of inflection. At the same time, the stakes of national security have never been higher. We are engaged in continents around the world where conflicts are simmering or worse. And clearly, the department, really for a decade now, has been trying to figure out what happens and what do we need to do at the intersection of those two things. And over that period of time, the department has been reorganizing and investing and changing its approach to that strategy, and ultimately landed on the formation of a Chief Digital and AI Officer whose primary mission was to answer this question and solve that problem. And that is what we're next to. So we could not be more fortunate to have this opportunity to ask you to look back on 4 years of having served in the department, wrestling with this and a lot of other issues. So I'm not going to go through your bio, everyone can see it online, but one of the things that was really exciting the moment that Radha was appointed to this role is that she actually worked at Google and Facebook and lived in the tech industry and has done the studies at Rand and was an economist, but also has a defense experience. And so those of us in the industry were really relieved to have someone in that role who had been a bridge builder between both worlds. And we really felt at that moment like the right person to take the reins of that. But before we get into all the AI stuff, I want to ask you some other questions about some of the roles that you had before that, and sort of get into it. So first, I wanted to ask you, just to sort of like set the stage for the audience a little bit. There's a lot of people here who've thought a lot about defense policy or thought about strategy, but maybe never, walked the halls of the E-ring. So can you just walk us through a day in the life of the senior leaders, as when you were chief of staff or deputy secretary? Like, what is a typical day?
That's a lot of that's the short answer. But I think maybe just taking a step back and putting the Department of Defense in context. A lot of people, when they think about the Department of Defense, you think of major platforms of weapon systems, planes and tanks and missiles and so forth. But it's a huge enterprise, right? Like just like any other huge enterprise, it's almost $1 trillion. It has 3 million people in the workforce, so give or take a little right now. And no comment. But more importantly, it has to manage this huge enterprise because the business of warfighting is what enables the enactment of warfighting, and that is what the deterrence foundation is on. So that means things like you've got bases, 750 bases all over the world that need to be prepared and managed in any contingency, and yes, those are conflict contingencies, but they're also weather and world events. You've got more planes than most transportation organizations like FedEx. You've got more a supply chain 3 times that of Walmart. You've got a healthcare system with 9 million beneficiaries, a school system that's bigger than most major cities in the United States, a housing system that looks like several of the large state universities put together, right? So these are all enterprise management questions that the department has to answer. And I give you that context because the Deputy Secretary is the Chief Operating Officer of that department. So her job is to manage that enterprise so that whatever kind of operational decision needs to be made, whether that's responding to a volley of missiles in the Red Sea, or providing hurricane relief around the United States, or managing transportation of COVID vaccines, or transporting baby formula when there's a shortage, right? All of those are different missions that the department has to execute in a matter of minutes and hours, not months and weeks. And so that's really what the office is. So a lot of the day-to-day life is really mundane management of those every single one is a no-fail mission, and that combination of making sure you've got the readiness, the people, the policies, and doing it in the pressure of every single one of those could be called on at any minute for any contingency at any time, anywhere in the world, is kind of the duality that E-ring that E-ring has to manage.
That does not sound stressful at all.
No, it's very good.
So just to take it at a human level for a moment, as a leader, how did you manage and navigate through that kind of pressure?
So I think a couple of things. I'm going to shock everyone by saying I'm a structure person. So the way, in part, we manage is by creating. The world is extremely unpredictable. The Department of Defense is really at the whim of some of that unpredictability. The more you can create a structure and a process that sort of bounds that, so that your staff has expectations of what they're going to walk into, how it's going to be managed. If there's a crisis, what is that going to look like? What is we call a battle rhythm? What's the schedule of meetings? When are things going to be expected, right? All of those processes that, again, sound mundane, create the structure that gives people the ability to execute in the face of continued and ongoing pressure. The other thing is you've got to create space for people to human, right? So when it's not a crisis, they need to be able to leave and go to doctor's appointments. You need to, when it's not an emergency, end your day. I will be home every day. I have young kids. They're 5 and 7 now. My youngest was 1 when I came into the department. I was like, I will be home every day for dinner. I will do dinner and bedtime, and I'm offline unless it's a global emergency for those 3 hours every evening, and I will come back on later with their email, right? But you setting those boundaries and modeling them, I think, helps people do whatever the set of things they need to do to manage over time, because it's execution in a minute is not going to help you manage a contingency, right? You need that execution every single day in a consistent and predictable way, and you've got to create the environment.
I love that you use human as a verb. But that really is something that I think kind of radiated off the leaders that you worked for.
Yes.
That was part of the tone that they set.
Yes.
And I can say sort of the tone that you set. I think that's awesome. Let me turn to maybe a more cheerful question than some of these crises and how to manage them. One of the things I remember from my time in the department was just the incredible opportunities to meet people and see things around the world that you just would normally never get to do as a typical citizen. And so if you think all the travels around the world you've been, was there a particular trip that you just pause and thought to yourself, wow, it is so cool that this is my job. I can't believe this thing I got to do. Obviously it's unclassified.
So many. I will say, one trip I went on was when I was the Deputy Undersecretary of A&S, and I went for a test on a boomer submarine. The submarines are carried for weapons, not nuclear weapons. It's just a test on how they fire. All of this is and I got to go out. We did the test. The test went long into the window, so we ended up staying overnight there. You got to just see how like the sailors, the submariners on that ship operate. And it's amazing. It was the first integrated crew with men and women, and you know, I asked, like, I think partway through, I asked them, like, you know, how's integration? They're like, well, we had to make this sign and hang it up with Velcro so we know when a man or woman's using the bathroom. It's a real hardship here on the so, and as you might imagine, it was just like they definitely had the vibe of like, I was the olds asking them about this, and like, they just had a mission, they know how to operate. Why was I kind of like bothering them with this, like, this weird DC debate we're having, right? And it was just a good reminder of like, but meanwhile, they were hand in glove through the night. There were a couple issues, they worked through it together. When it was time for a turnover, the turnover was seamless, right? It was like such a reminder of both the awesomeness of the like platforms and systems we have, because let's be honest, something so cool. But also how awesome the crew and the service members we have that are on those, and you know, you don't often get to just be up close watching them and seeing what they do, and it was, you know, it was amazing. Very fortunate.
I'm going to tread lightly here, but I would point out that is a pretty remarkable story, because for those of you that don't follow this particular issue so closely, having men and women serve together in submarines was one of the most controversial issues at the time that we were debating those policies about integrating women into all positions, because there were a lot of people in the Navy who thought that those were the stressful conditions in which it would be impossible, and yet what you saw them in action is like, well, we had, you know, Velcro solve this problem, which was, by the way, a great innovation back, you know, in the 60s. So that's tie it all back to South by. So that's incredible. So also one of the things, when you think about the pressure and the stress of that job, you know, a lot of people don't serve for all 4 years. But you actually managed, like, that is not only a policy accomplishment, that is like a feat of stamina. So I wanted to ask you, just, you know, this is kind of an exit interview, sort of like, if you reflect back on that period of time, what were the successes that you're most proud of? Like, where were the things where you said, you know, I want to have an impact on this, and you're like, you know, we got that done?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are one's innovation related and one's not. Let me just do the non-innovation related. I think the Independent Review Council on Sexual Assault really was a generational transformation in how the Department of Defense executes military justice, and that's so important both for the service members and for recruitment and retention of the best qualified people we need. So I think like that was transformational for the department.
Unpack for us
So it relates to how the department investigates and prosecutes when allegations of sexual assault are filed. And it moved the decision and the prosecution process from the commanders, who often oversaw both the alleged perpetrator and the victim, to a like more traditional court system in the military justice system, which allowed victims to feel more confident in the outcome, but also allowed commanders to manage the performance and morale of their workforce without having to suddenly turn into expert prosecutors and judges. So, you know, that transformation, biggest change in the military justice system in decades, I think really ended up being what I would say in my economist words is Pareto improving. I think actually everyone ended up better off for the transformation, but as we were going through it, figuring out how to do it and motivating it and explaining it was actually really hard. I think we got to a good place, but kind of much like where I started, a lot of the work to do it was unsexy, right? It was like a detailed commission with technical experts who provided concrete, you know, 70 recommendations, and then an implementation plan, and then a detailed review, line by line, the manual for courts martial, right? Like it's the business of government, the outcomes are so big, but the ways to do it are little increments and little ideas that have to get executed over and over again over a long period of time. But more broadly, and sort of in vein with kind of shifting gears a little, I think the department actually took a lot of leaps and bounds on its digital modernization over those 4 years. We came in, one of the things I worked on with Deputy Secretary Hicks was the data decrees, and really moving the department to treating data as a strategic asset. I will say, coming from Google, I managed a cross-product sort of data science analytics team. We managed business analytics for all of the products in a range of compliance and safety issues. And the idea that you would manage a $1 trillion budget, a $3 million workforce with these critical assets, and like you didn't have dashboards of just like performance. Like it was just, you're just like, or like you have these giant binders of spreadsheets. I'm not kidding. Like that's how you manage the budget. Like that modernization needed to happen, and in fairness, it had started before we got there, right? David Norquist was the deputy secretary before we got there, had really elevated this Advana program to create an analytic backbone, and we kind of continued. Deputy Secretary Hicks made that the program, the default program for all of the costing and a range of other business data inside the department, and that progress I think really mattered. But and then tying that to the warfighting, so deploying these AI and data teams out to each of the COCOMs, our ATA teams, I think to really push forward on deployment. And then really, the last thing I will say is really getting to a concrete way to do what we in the department call CJAG C2, which is Combined Joint All-Domain Command and Control. Really, the way you should think about it is there's a whole bunch of data on what's going on in the world. Everyone was looking at different cross-cuts of what that looked like, and that made conversations extremely difficult, but very manual. What we did is create a digital interface that creates a common view for 4-star commanders and operators, and then a way to do that planning and collaboration to come up with response option or operational plans in a more modern and digital way, instead of in a manual cut and paste from 15 different screens and put it on one PowerPoint slide. So that type of digital transformation over a 4-year period, especially with everything else going on, I think is something that I'm really proud of, and I think was a really big push from the secretary and the deputy secretary all the way down the chain.
That is a extraordinary set of achievements. How about misses? Was there anything that you had really hoped to get across the finish line didn't make it?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're not where we need to be on like Gen AI adoption. I think there's more promise there. I think the department rightly wanted to focus on what responsible use meant, and I think that we probably lagged in doing some initial testing and prototyping that we could have done in parallel rather than in serial with that, and I think that ended up being slower. We're lagging a little bit there. I think the biggest kind of thing I wish we had been able to convince, and some of this is the department, some of this is Congress, some of this is just world events, is really getting a lot of that tech debt drawn down, right? Like our IT systems are bad. We don't have enough compute. We barely have enough cloud capabilities, right? Like there's just and that creates drag on the system, even if you had the willingness and the culture to drive adoption, you would have the tech debt that would create a drag in the system. I underestimated how hard it is to modernize existing infrastructure, and it's hard.
Delete it.
Yeah.
That's my advice.
I'm sure some people trying that right now.
Yeah, I'm sending you there, but I'm gonna ask a different question. So you served at DOE and DoD, and so you had a lot of different roles in government. Was there anything this time that surprised you?
It's a good question. I think when I was there in the Obama era, now I was in more junior roles, so maybe this just was less apparent. I think there was an elevation in this time of the role of the economic, what were traditionally more domestic focused economic sides of the cabinet, to kind of balance that with the national security side. So Department of Commerce obviously and Treasury always had an important role to play in things like export controls and sanctions, but there are parts of those organizations that also have important roles to play on domestic investment and domestic enablement. Those had a seat at the table in national security discussions in a way that just wasn't true before. And so, as an example, of the Department of Energy, we really had two sides when I was there. The side that manages the nuclear enterprise and was always in, various conversations on nuclear modernization and reliability and surety of that enterprise. And the side that does like energy and science, right? And those are two separate conversations. That was very much one conversation in this administration, and access to resilient, diverse sets of energy, for instance, was like a critical area for the Department of Defense to deal with contested logistics. Thinking about science and innovation and those STEM investments in national labs was really important for the innovation ecosystems at DoD and the entire intelligence community. So I think the bridging of those conversations was really good in the end, but there definitely took some turns of the crank to get those conversations. There's just two very different languages that needed to come together.
Different cultures.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you have any advice for the leaders of the Trump administration as they come in, maybe on like how to pass an audit or anything like that?
So here's what I will say, and I, certainly.
You can laugh, that was fun.
It is always tempting when you come in to kind of throw out what the other team did and assume they did it wrong, but also to make big changes by memo and then not follow up with implementation guidance. So the advice I would give is, look, you know, every administration is gonna brand things and make them their own. Absolutely, this administration can and should do that, and that should be expected, and people shouldn't freak out about it. And I think though, I'm hopeful there will be important innovations that come out. You just saw there was a memo on the software acquisition pathway using commercial solutions offerings and OTAs as a sort of default solution for software procurement. That's actually, I think there are tweaks along the margin I would make, but as a concept, I think it's a great idea. But the thing is, that won't get implemented in the way they want it, which is it won't be the CSO process that DIU uses if there isn't implementation guidance that allows that to scale. And so my best advice is think about not just the intent, but actually how this scales in implementation, because the devil's in the detail for the federal government actually executing things to make that transformation.
Yeah, I remember one of the challenges that DIU had was they had a shortage of trained acquisition officers to manage the throughput of the contracts they wanted to do, and without, you know, saying anything that I shouldn't say, I did have a DIU friend yesterday point out that as excited as they are about the policy change, which is the right decision, they don't have hundreds of acquisition officers who can support having everyone in the department come to them.
Right.
That's the kind of thing that maybe would have come out in sort of deliberate policy process you described for the staff road changes that maybe didn't occur.
Yeah, but I would say the flip side is there are hundreds of acquisition officers across the Department of Defense, and they are inherently sort of risk and change averse, but also inherently rule following. And if there is a way to capture and codify the DIU process and disseminate that across the department, and there is a checklist, they will use that checklist instead of their old checklist, right? So there are ways to scale ex post, and I guess what I would say is sort of, again, not to be the most boring government worker there ever was, but just, you know, the more you can focus back to the mundane, the sort of little ideas, the little steps that need to happen for execution, the more you'll actually see transformation.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if you could put that in a tweet.
Yeah.
But
I think they send it to character.
I don't even know what to call it anymore. But anyway, if you exit, which I guess is appropriate for Doge, a lot of things are getting exited. Anyway, sorry, that one wasn't as funny as last one. I'm sorry. More seems to be a less joke. Okay. So one of the things I wanted to ask you about also is, you know, you had some very conventional roles. You were the Deputy Undersecretary of Acquisition and Sustainment. Everyone sort of knows what the Chief of Staff does. But when you came in to sort of inherit the CDA organization, which was like a year and a half old, that is really like more like a startup in government. Tell me, what was the scene when you took over, and what did you do, and what is it like to be more like an intrapreneur and less of the sort of administrator of a system?
So look, I think CDAO, so let me just by way of a little bit of backstory, CDAO really brought together, I think, pockets of innovation that were happening, right? The JAKE, which was the Joint AI Cell. We had the Chief Data Office, which was doing a lot of creative policy making and with their Chief Data Officer authorities. The Advana team that I mentioned, which had built a really nice data analytics infrastructure stack. So the idea was kind of the sum of the parts is greater than the whole. I think there was the fusion of technology and the fusion of people, and it's helpful to sort of think of those in two separate parts. I think that tech processes, like the delivery, was and continued to be built. Like when I came in, the technical foundations that they had sort of built up in terms of like the compute infrastructure and the data infrastructure in terms of ingestion and storage, all of that was good, but there were things we needed to do to modernize at the time that would have been true no matter where those entities existed. So, you know, and they were just building up like the good news is that technology, we're not innovating anything there, right? Like you could draw that technology stack at any large enterprise, and it had to have the compute layer, it needed to have the data infrastructure and storage and ingestment layer, the data management, and then it needed to have dev environment. So like we kind of like worked our way through that, and they were very much on the journey that needed to happen. people are much messier than technology, frankly, and merging people and cultures is always really hard, and creating something from 3 or 4 distinct cultures, I think created a lot of friction in both kind of defining people's reason for being there, like what was their extrinsic motivation for work and what their delivery was, and just creating cohesion in delivery. So what I walked into, I think, was partway through tech foundation building, and then a culture of people that didn't really have the sort of psychological safety and collegial trust that was needed to really build at the pace they needed, and that was a lot of the focus. So we did a lot of town halls and meetings and talking about it, but also a lot of very transparent, my general belief is the way to build trust is over communication and transparency, and so we did a lot of let's have some roadmaps, and let's do this in a systematic process. So I came in, we did an assessment of the work they were doing. We called it the 3 Ps exercise, and they had to, what do you want to prioritize? What are we going to pace to slow down to give you more bandwidth? And what can we pause for now so that we can free up and focus on the things you want to prioritize? And then you have your priorities, and then you make a roadmap, and that roadmap has some milestones, and those milestones then create accountability, right? This is not super exciting, and I'm not breaking any new management ground here, but that's sort of what I think was missing, was that structure that needed to bring the really good tech foundation, the really hard work that was happening, to a structured delivery process that could scale and be reliable for the Department of Defense.
I really like how you draw that emphasis of cultures, for just double clicking that little background. One of those organizations, the Defense Digital Service, they have branded themselves as the SWAT team of nerds, and they drew a lot of inspiration from Star Wars and now wore hoodies. You had that data team from Atlanta had come out of the comptroller organization, right? Like an opposite culture of that. Less hoodies there for sure. Northwest fly not wearing a hoodie. And then of course, Jake had been born out of the intelligence community originally, and so they brought that culture. A lot of them were in uniforms, were very joint staff culture there. So really different tribes all had to come together under your watch. And so I want to, when you think a bit about the culture of the department and the impediment that it occasionally presents, you talked about risk aversion, to adopting to completely AI, what are some of the cultural barriers that you saw that you think impeded that digital transformation process, and what changes might be made to try to reduce some of that resistance?
So I think a lot of times we treat differences of opinions and approaches as conflict rather than collaboration. And my old boss, Kat Hicks, had this term that she called, which was collaborative disruption. And I think there's a similar collaborative disagreement sort of approach here, which is the department is truly hierarchical. I mean, there's probably no hierarchical place in the world, and that's a feature, not a bug. But there still needs to be place for that sort of open conversation and discussion, because there is fundamentally going to need to be trade-offs that senior leaders and leaders at all levels are going to have to make, right? Sometimes you want to move fast, but the security requirements are real, and the threats to what happens if you get it wrong are significant. So they're going to have to make trade space there. You're not going to adopt at the speed you could if the missions were lower risk, and there are some lower risk missions where you can. There are going to be times when you need to prioritize back-end options versus front-end delivery, and that's going to upset a different set of customers than the back-end pieces, and you're going to have to make those trade-offs. There are times when you want to really hear and elevate the views of operators who have to be the end users rather than the technologists, and come up with a solution that is less technologically sexy because it is more user-friendly, right? And that's a discussion you want to have, right? There's not a wrong answer here. These are trade-offs and trade spaces that you have to make, and that all large enterprises have to make. I think that the thing that is difficult in the Department of Defense is that is hard. I'll use acquisition as another example, right? Sometimes you want to move fast and you want to be able to fail and have things that don't work. Also, this isn't our money, it's taxpayer money. And we owe a responsibility to be faithful stewards of that, and we can't be as risk-taking as you could in the commercial sector, or at least not on the same scale, right? So but you don't have to be, and I think taxpayers would agree, and we hear this from our congressional representatives, there is some tolerance for more risk than we're taking, right? But these are all trade spaces and discussions we have to have. And if we come into it, I was the DoD's A&S on a very traditional acquisition side, and I was leading an acquisition team inside CDO that was very much on the forefront of how we do acquisition. those don't have to be in competition with each other. They don't have to be, fundamentally antagonistic. You want both of those voices because you want the traditional acquisition guy saying, hey, we have these processes so we know there's competition. So we know just because someone's in charge or because someone has friends that they're not getting the contract, and there's a documented process by which people get those contracts. We want to have clear performance criteria so that when you select someone, it's not based on favoritism, it's not based on a myopic view of what you need, it's based on true work ethic, right? Like those are all, there's underlying reasons for all of those slow things. But we can also do them faster, and those ways to do them faster, the ways to modernize it, those conversations have to come together. And so the thing, like if I could like wave a magic wand and change it, the thing I would change is really the tolerance for hearing opposing or disagreeing views and trying to identify the kernel of what is useful there and pulling that into your own view and kind of everyone moving in a direction. And I think that's really hard in the department, and the processes make it hard and the culture makes it hard.
Yeah. Just actually, what you said is so interesting. You had that experience in the traditional acquisition system, and then you were moving into the digital startup, venture-backed, or AI space.
Yeah.
And what did you see as being the lessons that you wish those two communities learned from each other?
Maybe what I will start with is lesson I learned, which is I had not worked in an area that had sort of engagement with venture investments or external investments, capital investments, the private market. And my big takeaway is the government needs to be way clearer about what it's doing and why, because that information can drive capital, and that capital can solve all sorts of air quotes value of debt problems, right? Like the government doesn't have to solve all of the transition problems, all of the decisions and bets on what should scale or shouldn't, what should grow and shouldn't. And frankly, the government probably shouldn't because we're not very good at it. Right? But what we can do is say, hey, these are our requirements. Like, this is what we mean by requirements. Let's translate that into normal English words so people who are building things can understand them. Okay, we're going to do this process. This process typically takes this long, right? And it doesn't even, I'm not even suggesting shortening it, but I'm saying it takes 15 months to get an ATO. That's too long. But if that's the reality, and these are the milestones, and these are the things we're going to look at, and you can be transparent about that, investors in the private market can make decisions about who's likely to make that and not. And my takeaway over my time at CDAO was the more transparent you could be, both in big settings and smaller settings, the more you could create a market system that helps kind of reinforce what the government's doing. I think that's a big miss on the way we do acquisition right now. It's an acquisition that was built at a time that didn't have industry that could kind of match and grow it. And I think you've got a vibrant innovation sector that's trying to match what the government needs. So that transparency is where I would kind of drive change.
Very cool. In the intro, we talked about the Gen AI moment. So I want to bring us back to that a little bit. Do you think the department is underappreciating or overhyping the impact that Gen AI could have?
Both. Which is so let me take that in two parts. So one is, I think the department is underappreciating how much Gen AI in a human machine teaming kind of way can be adopted in low risk to make a lot of things faster. I'll use the example of we had a Gen AI pilot on contract writing and acquisition more generally, which is basically just, there are a lot of contracts. You can put them in a context folder that any model can use as reference documents, and you can generate early contract drafts. And you can look at contract drafts. Then if you evolve that model, and they're trying to do this, you can interact with it to say, hey, I want to see some examples of innovative language on IP, or we're hearing this feedback. Can you give me draft language on X, Y, or Z? You still need a contracting officer to review that language and put it in the right place and do the negotiations. I think this isn't a substitute, but it can really accelerate that contract writing delivery process, which anyone who's been on either side of trying to execute a contract knows is like a really long, when everyone's agreed on everything, they will call it acquisition physics. The acquisition physics of getting the contract out is, too long, I'll just say it. Right? So I think there are a bunch of things like that the department really underappreciates. On the other hand, I think the department, I don't know if it underappreciates or rightly appreciates that there's real risk in bringing Gen AI into the operational sphere and creating the right bounds on what it can do and how it can help operators make sense of kind of intelligence in real time, speed that up, can help come up with operational plans or courses of action and certain contingencies. I'm sure there are applications there. The risk of error there is really high. And so in a world where, you know, you wanna make sure you're getting to high reliability, those may be areas you want to lag. But I think the department's approach on this doesn't have to be all or nothing. You can pick the areas you want to invest in. I'll just say the number one thing I think the department and the federal government underappreciates is how much that back-end infrastructure matters. Like, you've gotta have the compute, you've gotta have the data management, you need AI-ready data, you need scale, right? Like, there's a whole bunch of things where in industry, if you were having an enterprise stack, you would spend 80% of your time and resources on that infra and 25% maybe on the application layer. It's exactly flipped in government, and that is a problem.
When I think about how we're speculating about how AI could be useful in warfare, it seems to me that we often call it a race. It's probably better described as a contest or a competition. But I think what's different about this contest than some prior ones, which I think were really more about like accumulating more mass than the adversary, or perhaps overmatch between one capability and another. You think of, like, you know, the tit for tat with detection and stealth technology. This one seems to be more about a contest for speed and the pace of adoption. And I wanted to comment, and you think about the way the department readies itself for the next decade of competition. How does this temporal element play a role? And I'll give the example, just, you know, this year, I worked at Google, this year we had 3 major seismic changes in the Gemini model in 1 year.
Yeah.
You know, we do not have 3 block upgrades of the F-35 in 1 year. You know, by comparison. So, just by
There's a lot of jokes there.
There's a lot of jokes. There was multiple. Okay, so can you talk a bit about the temporal element of competition?
Yeah, let me make just a finer point on that, because I think you're exactly right, which is, if you look at the conflict in Ukraine, the turnaround in the upgrades on the autonomous systems, not the hardware, but the software and the comms, the communication stuff, that is on 2 to 3 week cycle. It started out on 6 week cycle. Even at its fastest, the department is probably on, what, 6 to 9 month cycles, right? If you're talking small dollars and like low requirements and maybe sole source or you know, direct award, right? Those are, we're orders of magnitude up. So in a world where the adoption model is one that needs, agility is not even the right word, right? It's rapidity. You need to be able to iterate and change and cycle things in and out. The mindset of what digital solutions need to look like has to change. I think the department needs to move into a place where it's really comfortable with modularity and replaceability. What do I mean by that? I mean, you have a capability you need. The thing that is going to do that capability is going to change, and it may be changed by provider, and it may change by exactly what it delivers and how it delivers, and the infrastructure and the integration environment needs to be set up for that. So that's the replaceability part. The modularity part is the pieces are almost surely, at least in this phase, not going to be created by a single company or even a single set of companies. And that set of companies is likely not to be static. So you need replaceability where, I'll use the example of an iPhone, which is, you know, you want your phone and you want to be able to put whatever apps you want on it. But you also want, when there's a new phone out there, to be able to replace that phone and to move all of your apps and data to that new phone seamlessly. We ought to be able to do both of those things in the Department of Defense, especially for critical warfighting capabilities, and we're not postured to do that either on acquisition or fielding, and so that's not great.
Thank you for bringing up Ukraine. I think we can transition a little bit to a couple of traditional industrial-based types of questions, and then we'll turn to audience questions. One of the things that the conflict in Ukraine really revealed was what, you know, defense industry wants to talk about magazine depth.
Yep.
And how we were drawing stockpiles down faster than we could replace them, and it really exposed some supply chain issues that everyone experienced really viscerally during COVID, spilling over into now the defense supply chain issues. Can you talk a little bit about what you think we need to do to make those supply chains more resilient and robust?
Yeah, so I think one, just as a reminder, I said in the beginning, but I'll say it again, the Department of Defense supply chain is huge, right? Like, we have 3 times the supply chain management problem with Walmart, right? And that also, we also have this
timing issue, which is in addition to our supply chain's reliability. So that is, we can't let people have leverage on us by being able to say, we're gonna turn the spigot off on X or Y, and that's gonna cause a problem for us. We also need the stuff, the parts, the maintenance, the weapons, to be in exactly the right place at the right time, and that right place, right time can change based on world conditions, right? So it's actually a dynamic optimization problem that is constantly changing with a lot of hardware that needs to move to a lot of places. And I say that to say that it's a really non-trivial problem that is particularly, there are many problems in the department that are not unique. This one I think is particularly pointed and unique. There are analogies, and you know, you can look at Amazon models, and you can look at Walmart models, we can look in a second. But the ultimate kind of problem there we're trying to solve on supply chains is a very unique one, and one that has real mission impact. So with that context, I think the department has sort of three things. One is the back-end system, right, warehouse management, dynamic routing and optimization of how we get things where, like that dynamic plan, that is a place where industry is way ahead of where the department is. We used, you know, we're starting to get there. When I was in A&S, we did a big push on warehouse optimization to digitize the inventory and have that be dynamically managed. But that process is something we don't need to invent that. That is being done well in industry, and we should be working to try to figure out how to integrate that. Part two is then the department, I think, needs to be able to, and we say illuminate supply chain. What I really mean is we need to say, here is what we mean by resilient supply chain in a very explicit way, and establish the accountability standards for our primes or for our integrators on what that means, along with collaborative tools that we can use to manage it, right? Like that has to be a collaboration with industry, because the department's not gonna put every widget together. We're not gonna be the integrators, especially on hardware, especially on, you know, hardware that's gonna be attritable like you might have for UAVs, right? So, or uncrewed systems more generally. So you need that, an ecosystem that has a much more collaborative and transparent engagement between the department and industry. I think that matters. And then the third thing is, we just have to invest in building more shit in America, more stuff in America. Language, Radha. So, and that is like not gonna happen overnight, but it can actually happen in relatively short order. Advanced manufacturing techniques mean you can get a lot of the sort of maintenance and parts pieces done. Working, you know, you see things like the CHIPS Act, which will help with microelectronics. And you see production investment in the United States. So I think all of that is really important. The last piece I'll just end with is it's not gonna be just the United States alone. And so one thing I worry about, and one thing that was a very active part of the discussion, is the economic statecraft part and the national security resilience and reliability part really fit hand in hand. And if you live in a world where you think what I will call friendshoring matters, then those national security alliances and things like tariffs or sanctions or economic policies intended to help domestic markets have real trade-offs in national security markets, and those need to be, in addition to the domestic economic potential effects, need to be considered in that context, because otherwise you could end up in a situation where you can't produce this domestically, you wish to produce it in places that had been more traditionally allies and partners, and now you've got economic policies sort of creating barriers that weren't intended on the national security side. And so that's a more robust conversation that just needs to happen on how you want to trade on those things.
I can't resist just taking like an interlude to tell a story that illustrates your point about the warehouse manufacturing, which was that we were touring a facility that manufactures very advanced aircraft, and our attention during the facility was drawn to a screen above the aircraft that was a very sophisticated dashboard tracking everything unique to that aircraft, of where it was in its supply chain, the parts that it needed, and where it was that day in its cycle, and it was all digitized, and it was awesome. And so I asked the gentleman that pointed it out to me what he was doing, because I noticed that he was writing down numbers from the screen on a clipboard. And he explained that his job was to walk the entire factory floor and write down updates on each plane from the screen, because there was nothing in the contract that said that this supplier was supposed to provide this data to the department. So they had to use O&M dollars to hire a services worker to read the screens, because they couldn't report the dashboard information that they were using. So we had updated the factory, but we couldn't share the information. And it was one of these things where we were like, So you're like halfway right and totally wrong at the same time. And you imagine, that those warehouse companies you're talking about, like all of this is done by robots, it's all digitized, and it's all forecasted. And like, that's what we need to do. So anyway, I just thought the audience would be curious. So like, that's such a great example of what you were sharing. Let me ask you a couple of questions about the budget. So we were a bit surprised to learn that we're getting an 8% cut in the department budget, and I was wondering if you had to make an 8% cut, how would you go about doing it?
Well, first of all, it's not an 8% cut. It's a drill to identify if you had to reduce the resources you were spending by 8%, what would get cut. And I expect that that will be realigned to priorities for the administration. And I'll note, while the magnitude of this is different, we did this during sequestration. We did, I think, a 5% or 3% drill, right? Because, right? And we did a slightly different version of this when we came in, which is Secretary Hicks identified 6 priority areas to review, determine trade-offs, right? So this is, again, the magnitude is larger, and there are real impacts, and it riding along things like pauses and changes in contracts and reductions in the federal workforce really do will have impact. But I think it's important to note, right now, it's not even an offset, or it's just a drill. It's a budget drill to identify where the costs, and actually, if you're going to realign priorities, it's a very responsible and pretty standard way to do that. There's also a list of 17 areas that were protected. I'll note as an example, autonomy within that area, as was audit, to your earlier point. So those are areas where you might imagine that where offsets are identified, additional dollars will flow, right? I mean, I don't have any inside knowledge, so I'm opining here, but that's how I would do it if I were managing a memo in a process like that. The last thing I'll just note is Congress has a say here, and while there's a lot of eaches in the budget, there's a lot of fence dollars that are very hard to move around with. There are minimum numbers of purchase on ships and aircraft that are legislated by Congress, and as you might imagine, those actually lock up huge amounts of dollars in the department. So it will be interesting to see how the department grapples with those statutory requirements while trying to identify offsets in the kinds of programs they want without kind of, that negotiation will need to play out.
I have a fun last question for you before you're the audience. So the chairman of the House Armed Services Committee said this past week that we should increase defense spending to 4% of GDP. It's just under 3% today. So that would increase the DoD budget by about $100 billion. If you had an extra $100 billion for defense, where would you spend it?
I would spend it on back-end data infrastructure. Like, I would spend it on compute and more reliable and resilient and elastic compute, so not just static fixed, but actually some ability for scalability. So if you have a contingency and everyone's looking at their common operating picture, you don't have latency. I spend it on data infrastructure to modernize it, to include all of the data that currently sits in the program offices and acquisition officials and link that to the financial management data. And I'd spend that on then a bunch of pilots with a link to longer term funding sources to bring in a bunch of modern AI and frankly advanced data analytics. Like, you don't even need Gen AI, Razvan has, so that would be great too. But even like, there's a bunch of ML, like sort of more supervised learning, ML ops type things that would make huge difference in the department and probably create efficiencies down the road. So I think you could invest $100 billion and get a huge return on that, in short order, 2 to 3 years, because that's the nice thing about software solutions. They can deploy quick and actually perform workflows in relatively short timelines.
Well, you're not going to get any pushback from me. Spending $100 billion on data and compute. All right. Yeah, exactly. That was a great answer. I agree. All right, your turn, guys.
Hello, Jake Crowley here. Really enjoyed the conversation. I wanted to kind of follow up on that last bit of commentary, and it was highlighted as a miss from you before, and now you're kind of as opportunity. Generated by AI, and just the tier 1 of efficiencies is amazing. But as you two know from the time of Google, creativity from Gen AI is where you really get those leaps and bounds. Now, how do you overlay those leaps and bounds from the generative AI with agencies and with war agreements that have to be put in place to keep, a little bit of safeguards? How do you overlay those two aspects of saying, okay, we want the AI to be creative and get us to the pinnacle of competition, but we also want to respect where we are with those safeguards?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really hard, question when you put it in direct operational context. I will note that there are ways to do it that, you know, where you can impact planning and posture that don't have to push up against, like, how you optimize, say, your missile defense strategy, but rather how you think about where do I want to, in the context of all of the weather and all of the potential political activities, posture and have my, you know, my munitions, my fuel, my storage, right? There's a whole logistics line where you can be creative. You can be creative on that, right? Like, there's a lot of workflows where we can get comfortable with this that would generate real operational lethality impacts, but feel a lot more comfortable and let us test it out. And my view on this is really, you're gonna learn by doing. So you wanna find the places where the risk is tolerable, even if a little uncomfortable, but the return is high, and test it out there, figure it out, and now you have another place where the return is high, and the risk is a little higher, but now you understand better, so you know how to mitigate that risk and rinse and repeat, right? It's not a silver bullet, it's not like we're just gonna deploy AI and kind of see what sticks to the wall. I think you want it to be more targeted, but I think you gotta turn that crank, and you gotta do it at speed, right? You gotta do it like every 90-day cycle.
Sure. One or two more? Bill?
Hey, Josh.
From the way.
Good to see you. Bill Eggersmith, just so you mentioned Gen AI, but the big new thing in the industry is agentic AI, AI agents, recommendation systems, and so I'm curious what you see in terms of the prospect of that, and whether it's too early still to be deploying that in a big way.
I mean, again, I guess maybe I like to joke that I'm a little ideas person, and I feel like as a little ideas person, I want little idea deployment. So agentic AI makes total sense, and it's a natural evolution. For instance, I'll use the contracting example I used before. You have Gen AI that can generate draft contracts, and you can move to agentic AI where now you have like a junior contracting officer who can interact with a more senior officer and help iterate on drafts. That's very natural and hard for me to imagine people being terrified of a junior analyst or a junior contract writer in an agentic sense. Same thing with HR, right? Again, you're managing a system of 3 million people. So having agentic HR solutions to help navigate a number of those super easy to navigate government processes like HR probably has huge returns, probably huge relevance, right? So I think there are lots of areas. Do I think like an agentic operational planner that we should deploy on the floor of CENTCOM, like we're there? No, I don't. But I don't think anyone would think we're there, right? And so I just think rather than moving to these kind of sci-fi, terrifying, you know, killer robots kind of scenarios, just pulling all the way back and saying like, where could you actually drive efficiencies and improvements in lethality? A lot of that is in very low-hanging fruit that actually looks pretty similar to where the commercial sector is seeing it, right? It's HR, it's financial management, it's procurement, it's real estate management. We do all of those things in the Department of Defense, all to support warfighters. We can bring technology in to help get those better and figure out what the guidelines and guardrails need to be to then deploy them in scenarios where we want to be much more certain about how performance and returns.
Great, thank you.
Hi, John Seidel. You kind of just touched on this, but what would you see as the enduring problems that could only be solved with ML and generative AI and things that the department have tried to solve just couldn't with existing capabilities?
So that's a really good question. I think a little bit about this from time to time, and I think the broad way I think about it is we're generative AI. Let me leave the agentic piece to the side for a minute because I think that's a slightly different question. Where generative AI has real value to me is places where you want more generation, right? Where more ideas and more information and just including that in that generative process is really valuable, and doing it faster with more information can yield newer, better ideas. So I use contract writing because that's an easy low-hanging fruit, but you can imagine anywhere where you're doing planning, optimizing, aligning, right? Like, and that can be in any of the core functions. It can be in personnel management, it can be in readiness, strategic readiness, it can be in, you know, there's a whole digital engineering and design side of this, right? And you see that, which is very analogous to the work that's been done on protein folding, for instance. So I think the mental model I have is this has the highest return in these human-machine teaming. And what it really lets you do is create a new additional super fast element that can come up with like, what do you think of this idea? What do you think, would this work? Would this work? Would this work, right? Way faster than you can as a human, and with a much broader potential context window to offer up those ideas. And so kind of being creative and again, allowing experimentation with that and testing it out and saying, did this actually yield some return? Did we get something creative and new and interesting here? And then turn the crank on it. I think the agentic piece, just to one click on that, is a little bit trickier only because there are pieces, I think, that you want to have very specific kind of government information and you know, government, sort of inherently government functions, and thinking about where the agents are that and are not is just something, you know, you want to play out a little bit, which is different than generating options for a human, because you retain a very clear human managing and maintaining that information.
Well, we're coming to the hour, so I think we have time for one more, or two more. We have time for two quick ones. Great. Zach?
Zach Heineck with Radical Science Laboratories. I was curious right now with the increase of data centers and the demand right now for energy in our supply chain, especially with the fragility of the grid right now. What do you think is how do you bridge the gap? And we've talked a lot about risk, we've talked a lot about innovation, but especially with South by Southwest, while we're here, Capital Factory, how do we think about the role? Is it between private capital funding sources? Is it through the government to be able to help invest in more energy output sources that might be higher risk, such as something like fusion or something that could be a lot more? We've been at it for a while, and where do those kind of constraints come from? Is it more of all the hurdles and the licensing that you need to get to do that, or?
So there are probably three directions the government can take here. One is more energy sources, and I don't know that the government needs to buy those, but I think the land, the like sort of facility clearance land siting, especially for generation, especially for things like nuclear, are places where the federal government can streamline processes and also make federal lands available and so forth. You saw that in the executive order at the end of the Biden administration. Two is upgrading the grid itself, right? So great to have energy creation, and if you can put the data centers next to that energy, you solve this problem. But in a world where you want to transmit the energy and diffuse it, you also need to invest in the grid. That's something that really needs to happen, and we just don't talk about enough. And the third is find allies and partners where you can build data centers there and use their energies. And you see those conversations emerging with the Gulf countries as an example there. I think there are obviously complicated national security questions that need to get overlaid with that, but I think those are kind of the three areas the federal government kind of can play.
I'll get off the stage for the question. So Ellen Chang, nice to see both of you. So my question goes back to all the promise that new technologies, data technologies, Gen AI, ML come with. And then we run into a huge roadblock called ATI, which you mentioned before. And I'm wondering how, what advice do you have? Do we just teach the folks in the department to deploy it, or there's a lot of vendors from the outside, but then you hit this ATO wall?
So I think there's first of all, I totally agree. If I could like wave my magic wand and change something, it would be the ATO process, right? And I think that like culture, acquisition processes, I know how to drive change in those. This ATO process, I think, I will give you my thoughts, but I think this is a place where there needs to be a much more active and detailed dialogue with industry on where the pain points are, because we've got like 12 to 18 months. If we need congressional help, we should get it. But I think this is like the pointy end here of what needs to be solved. So my three ideas: one, kind of just embrace this up a little bit, right? It's gonna be a longer process than it should be, but we can do more between industry and government to actually lay out exactly what that process is. So it's not a like, bring me a rock, right? You brought me that rock, now I need a grass. Okay, you brought me that grass, now bring me that flower, right? Which I know can be how the process is. So I think the more we can, what I tried to do with CDAO is say, like, can we productize this, right? Like, what are the steps in this process? What are the milestones? What are the artifacts? And we had a, ATO reviewer, who I think was our authorizing official at CDAO, I think was very forward-leaning. I really liked his approach. But if we can say, okay, these are the artifacts that we need you to produce, this is the assessment I'm gonna do with it, then you can bring that list, you can have an expectation, it may still take, 9 to 15 months, right? This isn't streamlining the process, but you have an expectation on what is gonna be expected of you, how it's gonna be assessed, and then if you get through it, what the timeline for it is. So I think that's like phase one, near game, no real changes other than actually just documenting. Second, we started down the path in CDAO of having a government DevSecOps pipeline. I think that's a critical first step in that. I think once you have the list of stuff that ATO has done, then the government needs a productized version of the ATO process. You ought to be able to bring something in to a government-owned DevSecOps environment, hived off from the DoD's. You're not deploying it into the from the DoD information network. But hived off, so in a secure area where you can test and generate those artifacts in a repeated test and evaluation way that creates a more dynamic process. That's, I think, the medium term. You need step one to get there. Third is what you actually need is continuous ATOs, and that means you've got to actually rewrite the ATO process. And that has to do with a combination of getting the right people in the DoD, in GSA, and in Congress to create the flexibility that's needed there. And that's, I think, where attention should be spent in the next 12 to 18 months, because I think there's appetite to look at and change this, but it's going to need to be a collaborative conversation between government, industry, and sort of the outside experts who look at this. And I'm hopeful we're in a moment where, to end on a hopeful note, I'm hopeful we're in a moment where there's real appetite and understanding that this needs to change. And so we just need to make sure we seize that moment and actually drive transformation. Thank you.
I know we would all love to keep going, but all great things must come to an end, and we are at an hour. So let me just close by offering this. We are at a moment perhaps where federal service and public servants are not as celebrated as they have been at some other times in the past. And listening to you give this masterclass in acquisition reform, in ATO reform, in AI, in the department, in bureaucracy, in culture, really reminds me, and I'm sure all of us, how valuable it is to have a Princeton-trained economist with decades of public service experience in a role as pivotal as the roles you've been in the last 4 years. And I feel so grateful for your service, and I hope you're getting some sleep and to spend some time with your family now. But please, everyone, join me in thanking Radha, not just for a great hour, but really for everything you did to protect our country.